And now, a new Dominator's reign begins as we journey into the Rygar series, an underrated franchise in my opinion that hasn't really seen a new title in many years, but still has a loyal following. It might not have a vast number of original titles, but today we're checking everything from the original arcade classic and its numerous ports, the NES version that took it into new directions, and the often overlooked 3D reboot. So join me on this legendary adventure into every Rygar game. Rygar first debuted in arcades in 1986, developed and published by Tecmo, a now well-known company that got their start making arcade titles in the early 80s and eventually home consoles later in that decade, building upon beloved franchise in the years to follow like Ninja Gaiden, Tecmo Bowl, Dead or Alive, Monster Rancher, and Fatal Frame, among many others, until their eventual merger with Koei in 2009. Rygar's original arcade game was notably designed by Hideo Yoshizawa, who would later go on to work on the NES Ninja Gaiden trilogy and the Klonoa series. Now, there isn't much time spent explaining the premise of this game during the arcade game's Attract mode, unsurprisingly, other than it taking place 4.5 billion years since the Earth's creation, and the mentioning of a reign of a new Dominator. Some further details would be part of the game's marketing materials, and name this new Dominator and final boss as Rygar. Now, this Japanese arcade flyer goes hard, by the way. The Japanese version of the game also leaves our legendary warrior without a name at all, but eventually he would be referred to as Rygar once being released in other regions, which was maybe some kind of mistranslation of Rygar. Rygar lore would get expanded upon a bit more in future versions of the game that we'll get into later. And just for consistency's sake, we'll just call our dude Rygar from here forward. But getting into the gameplay, it's a side-scrolling action platformer in a similar vein to the hit Ghosts and Goblins, released a year prior in 1985. Rygar can run at a consistent speed, jump at a consistent height, and duck and climb ropes. Now, if you get hit once, you die. So to defend yourself from hordes of enemies, you've got a special weapon called the Disc Armor, a razor-sharp shield attached to a chain reminiscent of a deadly yo-yo, or perhaps a flying guillotine if you're a connoisseur of kung fu flicks. You can also bounce off of enemies, which can stun them or kill them if you have the right power-up. And as you move through the stages, stone statues appear that can be broken for various pickups, ranging from bonus points, extra time, or extra lives. Power-ups to improve Rygar's abilities include an increase in strength or length of the Disc Armor, an alternate upward attack, the already mentioned bounce upgrade, or temporary invincibility. There are also occasional hidden bonus points in certain spots, including a 1 million point scroll, and points do matter in this, as you'll gain extra lives depending on the machine's dip switch settings. There are a variety of enemies, with behaviors increasing in complexity as you progress through the game's 27 levels. And Tecmo really managed to handle a lot of sprites on the screen at once here, with some areas having a ton of enemies swarming you from the sky and underground, and things can get very frantic. Things get even more frantic if your timer runs out, as this giant red death cloud starts chasing after you until you reach the next little rest area. Shout out to rotatable urns. There are some basic platforming moments as well, or even some rope climbing sections. This is nothing too complicated, but adds another layer of danger when combined with certain enemy types. Luckily, Rygar's controls are quite snappy and responsive, allowing for rapid attacks as long as the Disc Armor connects with an enemy, and you've got mid-air jump control as well. One important note on the challenge here, in the original arcade version, you can continue with credit feeding as much as you like to a certain point. But once you reach level 21, you've got to finish the rest of the game on whatever lives you have left. I guess it's not a problem if you're aiming for a 1-credit clear anyway, but if you're just trying to beat the game, you might want to refresh your stock of lives with an intentional game over in level 20. Some later re-releases of this game got rid of this stipulation, so depending on that, the continue situation might not be an issue anyway. Overall, I'm a big fan of this game, and I've got some very fond memories playing this one when I was a kid. I had a great time pushing to the ending as an adult. I didn't manage to get a 1cc yet, but I wouldn't mind trying harder at it eventually. A lot of overcoming the challenge really comes down to observing enemy patterns, reacting accordingly, hanging on to the good power-ups, and optimizing your score to get some extra lives here and there. I really dig the aesthetic too, with its evolving landscapes full of bizarre mutated creatures that almost tell a story of their own without having to put things into words. The sound effects are great, like the iconic "huh" when Rygar jumps, and while there isn't much variety in music, the low-slung main theme fits the action well. It's an easy recommendation for me for fans of arcade stuff like Ghosts and Goblins or Karnov. So April of 1987 would see the release of a much different and more celebrated take on Rygar for the Famicom. But before that, let's get into the many more arcade-faithful ports first. 1987 would also see the release of many iterations on home computers, developed by Probe Software and published by US Gold. First up is the Commodore 64 port here, with pretty typical aesthetics that you would expect on the hardware. Obviously, it's not as pretty looking or sounding as the OG, but to its credit, it runs pretty smoothly. Which in a way is also to its detriment, as some of the enemies move insanely fast. One-hit death is still a thing here, and to make matters worse, you can't continue at all, so good luck. It's at least a bit shorter, scaled down to 16 levels, but it does lack the final boss fight with Rygar. Moving over to the ZX Spectrum, it also looks about like what you would expect on the hardware, with a little more sprite clarity than the C64, and it also runs quite smoothly. And while still quite difficult, it does feel a little bit more fair, but still, no continues. Now this version does include the full 27 levels, but it is lacking the Rygar boss. And finally, the Amstrad CPC port, possibly the nicest looking port with its range of colors and those chunky sprites, but unfortunately it's quite a bit choppier performance-wise. Rygar also has a very floaty jump here, which can help a bit to glide across the levels and avoid some dangers. There's still no continues, but this felt like the easiest of the 3 computer ports. It also has 27 stages and no Rygar boss, although some of the levels are a bit reworked and simplified, making the experience feel a bit more repetitive in return. I'm not sure how to recommend the best out of the 3 here, since each have their pros and cons, so I'd probably just go with your preferred platform of choice if you aren't interested in trying out each one. In 1988, Rygar would hit the Sega Master System with a Japanese exclusive release, Argos no Jujiken, and was published by Salio, a fake company within Tecmo that was formed to circumvent Nintendo's exclusivity policy for third-party publishers at the time, and Salio was also used to publish the Master System port of Solomon's Key. Now this version has a similar straightforward gameplay approach to the arcade original, but with heavily modified stage designs and structure. Everything is condensed into 5 larger stages in total, and it does include some new boss fights after each one of them being that big blue jumpy guy, and we've got another all-new boss. You fight each of them twice, and then level 5 does culminate with a battle with Rygar. Now, some other minor differences include the ability to take underground paths at times, and there's also quite a spike in difficulty here. The continues are unlimited at least, but some moments of the game almost feel like Kaizo Rygar in some ways. Yet it still feels quite fair, and it's actually quite addictive to keep pushing your way to the end. The aesthetics are solid on the Master System, albeit very heavy on the color red. Even our character is looking a little bit sunburned. Maybe he was hanging out barbecuing with Das Karnov or something. These guys gotta be drinking buddies, right? Anyways, I had never played this port before working on this video, and it was a pleasant surprise, and I definitely recommend giving it a shot sometime, as long as you're not expecting the expanded depth from the NES game. This might make for a good speedrun too. And next up, Rygar would also see a release on the Atari Lynx handheld console in 1990. Developed by Han Software, aka New Effects, and notably one of their first games before going on to make other titles like Crew Ball for the Genesis or Tasmania for the Game Gear. And later they would be bought out by EA, and they made a lot of basketball games there. But here we have a much more zoomed in viewport to accommodate for the small Lynx screen. But the essence of the arcade game is intact. Enemies have been adjusted accordingly to give enough reaction time, and your typical upward attack is no longer a default move, but is only granted by a power-up. Levels have been trimmed down to 23 in total, with a Rygar fight at the end, and while you can continue, they are limited. So this one is pretty tough overall, but it plays quite smoothly, and there's definitely fun to be had here for a miniaturized take. Also, despite the screen size, they did cram in some really nice parallax effects and animated environments here. The included manual also expands on the lore a bit, with a Conan-esque narrator explaining some of Rygar's origins. Now, going even further into the 90s, Rygar is still hanging on to relevancy with a 1994 release on the Sharp X68000 computer in Japan as part of the Video Game Anthology series. I don't have a ton to say about this one, other than it being a near arcade perfect port, which was impressive for 1994, but unsurprising considering the powerful hardware on this computer that was very well suited for this kind of thing. And other near-perfect arcade emulations would eventually follow in much later years, such as Rygar's inclusion on the Tecmo Classic Arcade compilation for the Xbox, the Wii's Virtual Console, an Arcade Archives release, or even for Android phones, if you don't mind getting interrupted by ads during the middle of a game. Speaking of phones, I have seen some shreds of evidence pointing to a Java port of Rygar from 2005, with some online reviews mentioning its appearance at a tech conference, and there's a small ad on the back of the Tecmo Classic Arcade manual. But sadly, I can only find a few screenshots of the game itself, so this one might be lost media for now. And last but not least, I'll mention one more port on the fan-made tip, Rygar for the Amiga, released by McGeezer in 2019. Much like the X68000 version, it's nearly arcade perfect, but the main draw here would have to be some additional stages, with 30 in total, adding some fresh and new challenges beyond the 27 in the arcade original. Now this one does not let you continue traditionally, so get ready for a sweaty 1cc, but it does at least feature a password system to start on certain stages. All in all, it's a great port. It runs well on the Amiga, features 1 or 2 button joystick support, and it's a wonderful tribute to the arcade classic. Now that we're done with the ports, let's go back to 1987 with Rygar's release for the Famicom in April of that year, titled Argus no Senshi Hachamecha Daishin Geki, and released in North America a few months later as Rygar, and finally also released in Europe in 1990. Rather than a straight port of the arcade original, Tecmo opted to transform this into a much grander scale of an adventure, and the plot is fleshed out a bit more in the included manual, setting us in the utopian land of Argul, where Rygar has attacked the peaceful world and stolen the Door of Peace. The legendary warrior of prophecy, Rygar, is then brought back from the dead to restore peace to the land, and he must visit the 5 Indora gods for the necessary items needed to reach Rygar's floating castle and destroy him, and then reopen the Door of Peace. Rygar lore went even deeper in Japan, with the release of some fully illustrated strategy guides, a manga, and even a choose-your-own-adventure book. But getting back to the gameplay, Rygar's movement does feel quite similar to the arcade game, other than the lack of an overhead attack. The structure, however, is more in line with a search action or Metroidvania title. Now, I know some folks cringe at my use of the term search action, but this is a great example of why naming genres after game titles can be a problem, as this version of Rygar predates Simon's Quest by a few months, so this technically beat Castlevania to the punch as far as integrating an open world and light RPG mechanics into its gameplay. Henceforth, this genre shall be named Rygtroids-likes. I will take no further questions. Semantics aside, this really does fit the formula, with an open world, tracking down clues and items needed to reach new areas, usually doled out by these wonderful cave grandpas. I should also mention a perspective shift as well, as the game sometimes switches to a top-down perspective in what you could consider Argul's hub. You can still jump in this view as well, so your capabilities don't feel drastically different here. You'll acquire equipment like the grappling hook, crossbow, and pulley needed to traverse the world, or even an ocarina needed to open up the path to Rygar's fortress. The world isn't so large to be overwhelming, but it's still a huge expansion from the straightforward nature of the arcade game. The light RPG mechanics come into play as you gain experience points from killing enemies, which gradually increases your tone, which is basically your strength, and also last, which is essentially your health. Some of the game's enemies and bosses take quite a few hits if your tone is low, so it doesn't hurt to take a little extra time to grind out a bit and get swole. Rygar also has 3 spells at his disposal, which can be used at the cost of stars, which are randomly dropped by enemies. Power Up increases the power of your disc armor until you die. Attack and Assail grants you a temporary ability to damage everything on the screen, and Recover refills your health. And despite the game world being much larger here, Rygar is lacking any sort of password or save feature. But it's at least somewhat forgiving in that you have unlimited continues, and continuing retains any of your items found and your levels of tone and last. And it just puts you at the start of whatever zone or even the boss fight that you died on. So if you're going into this for the first time, it might take a few hours of exploration to make any progress. As you can imagine, the game's clues can be on the cryptic side. But if you know where you're going, and maybe pick up a few speedrun tricks, you can probably finish the game in under half an hour. Or if you don't mind glitching yourself out of bounds into a wrong warp, maybe you can beat it in under 7 minutes. This game does have a fair amount of jank to it, pretty mild overall though, and for 1987, this is a very solid title, certainly a landmark for the genre. I really appreciated the expansion of the world of Argul, and it still retains that weirdness with the strange mutated monsters and bosses, or as the manual likes to call them, animalized men wriggling eerily. The music slaps as well, for the most part, with some very memorable themes, and some, this. I'm not sure what they were thinking here, maybe a Meow Mix ad placement or something. It's worth noting a regional difference here as well. The Famicom version has completely different music from the NES. The gameplay and content is otherwise largely the same between versions, other than some slight nuances that will affect speedrunners, but the alternate soundtracks are certainly worth a listen sometime. Overall, this is easily my favorite version of Rygar. While it might not get as frantic and intense as the arcade game, the much larger scope here makes the experience much more memorable. It's a fairly common cartridge if you're collecting, or you can also check it out on the Switch Online stash of NES titles if you're curious. Flash forward 15 years after the release of the NES game, and 2002 would see Rygar finally getting revived in a three-dimensional form, with Rygar the Legendary Adventure on the PlayStation 2. Rumors of its development circulated early that year when Tecmo announced their new 3D Ninja Gaiden title, along with another action-adventure game, and eventually this would be confirmed as Rygar later that spring, and first shown off at the E3 conference in May. The story here is set on the island of Argus, a fictional Mediterranean island controlled by Rome, taking place after the Roman Empire's conquest of Egypt. Now there's lots of liberties taken here in regards to actual historical events and places, but they do try to pull in many elements of Greek mythology here. Rygar is a renowned warrior in the Argus Navy, but strangely with no memories of his past. While attending a ceremony in the game's opening cutscene, Princess Harmonia is kidnapped by Titans, and Rygar is tossed into a pit. He's soon revived and given the disc armor, and tasked with stopping the dastardly plans of the Titans, and the plot does continue to develop through the game's many cutscenes, and I won't spoil any of the big plot twists to come, in case you haven't played this one yet. Okay, so looking at the footage, I guess some of you are thinking 3D action game, Greek mythology, combo-based combat with a chain-like weapon, fixed camera. What kind of God of War knockoff is this? It's fair to think this, but actually, Rygar came first by over 2 years. So yeah, Rygar walked so that Kratos could disembowel. Now, if anything, Rygar probably owes some of its design inspirations from Capcom's hit Devil May Cry, which was released earlier in 2001. And we do still have a fairly expansive world here, with a blend of battling weird creatures, platforming, and Ragtroid-like ability progression to access new areas. The world in general looks pretty great for the era, if not suffering slightly from the overuse of grays and browns, which was pretty common at the time. But it's also a lot of fun that many of the environments are destructible. If you're into destroying giant pieces of historical architecture, this is your game. And most importantly, we can rotate urns. I also found the boss fights to be a big highlight in this game. They're often quite large in scale and very dramatic, and often kinda gross. I found the difficulty a little uneven in these fights, with a drastic difference in challenge at times, but overall, they're fairly reasonable once you form a proper strategy. And for better or worse, depending on your tastes, there are no QuickTime events to be found. Overall, the feel of the play control during combat is okay. It's certainly not as fluid as later examples of the genre, but you do have a nice array of combos at your disposal, including new types of disc armor collected throughout the game with all new movesets for each. And each also has their own special summoning spell. You can even upgrade each of these disc armors with points that are collected from killing enemies and breaking objects. Or you can augment them with gems hidden throughout the world that have their own stat boosts or ability improvements. Socketing these gems isn't permanent either, so it's cool to freely customize your build to your liking. Also scattered throughout Argus are numerous lore documents and little unlockables for any completionists out there, or if you want to further immerse yourself into the story. Even with all these things to do, a playthrough of this game isn't overly long. You might even wrap up your first time through the game in under 10 hours. There are plenty of reasons to replay this if you like, with various difficulty options, a challenge dungeon where you must dispatch floors full of enemies to be awarded new items, a ranking system to grade your performance, and some absolutely wild unlockable things. Behold, Pizza Armor. The different pizza armors even have different themed toppings. Amazing. Now, I'll admit, going into this game, I wasn't expecting much, but in the end, I had a fun time with it. If we're throwing arbitrary numbers out here, it's a firm 7 out of 10 kind of experience. Nothing too great, but really it's a solid 3D action title that doesn't overstay its welcome. And it's certainly worth a look if you're a Rygar fan, or if you're into this genre in general.
I have accomplished my mission.
Thank you for everything. I don't know how to.
Oddly enough, this game did also get a port to the Nintendo Wii 6 years later, first releasing in Japan in late 2008, and in other regions in the months following, and with a new title, Rygar: The Battle of Argus. Paired with a completely different looking main character, sporting spiky white hair, tribal tattoos, and are those Jinkos? It's probably fair to think this might be a new game just looking at the cover, but in reality, not a whole lot has changed here. The story is still the same, even down to the cutscenes, although your new fit is really looking out of place. The gameplay feel and content of the game world is also basically the same, but with a slight improvement in graphical clarity and richer colors, and there's a few new enemy types and slight difficulty rebalancing, and you guessed it, motion controls. You can now end combos with a waggle of the Wiimote, but fortunately this is optional in the main game. You can still just use buttons to fight things. Exclusive to the Wii, however, is a separate Gladiator mode, a 30-stage survival challenge with a controllable camera. But all of the attacks are motion control based, even down to doing more damage with more dramatic arm flailing. It's an amusing addition, but it can get frustrating to deal with the waggle jank. Now, I didn't play through the entirety of this port, but honestly, it's really not a bad way to play this game if you don't mind the different character design. Understandably, critics certainly railed on this port when it came out. For a 2008 release, this surely felt quite dated and was a bit of a cash grab trying to lure people into thinking this was an all-new experience. And it's kind of unfortunate to say this would be the last official Rygar game released, not counting those straight emulations of the arcade or NES games. So it's a little bit of a disappointing way to fizzle out. I still hold out some hope for a new entry in the Rygar series someday. Maybe Koei Tecmo will bring our legendary warrior back from the dead for those loyal fans still out there. And I must mention, as a great example of the remaining love for this series, you should really check out this Complete History of Rygar book, full of all sorts of great details on all these ports, and even some interviews and fan art. Shout out to Retro Game Books for sending me a copy of this. It was really a big help in my research, and this is really a great resource if you want to dig even deeper into Rygar. A link to their store is in the description. And thank you for watching. I'd love to hear about your favorite memories of Rygar in the comments, if you've got any. And we'll catch you next time.